Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, ladies and gentlemen, wherever you are in the world. My name is Amar. On behalf of Defence IQ, welcome to this military mobility discussion group. I, alongside my colleague Lauren, will be on hand to support you. I just wanted to say a few opening words to thank all of the panelists in advance for their contribution to this discussion and how understanding they have been, as well as reacted to the world we currently operate in. I'd also like to say a special thanks to General Dynamics and their team for agreeing to host this discussion group to help bring us all together to ensure that the challenges that still remain are being addressed. As a community, we have traditionally met in a face-to-face environment. However, with the restrictions we all face, we have to adjust and adapt to new methods. I'm delighted to see how many people have joined this activity, and hopefully I will see you many more times moving forward as we keep the wheels and tracks moving forward. Before I hand over to the panel, I just wanted to run through the interface very quickly. Towards the bottom of your screen, you should see a top tips box and a Q&A box. The Q&A box will be how you communicate with us, Defence IQ, and the panelists. Please ensure when using the Q&A box you start your message with either tech or panel, and then your message so the relevant team can address the query. The panelists will be able to see the questions and remarks you put in, and will aim to address as many as possible in the time frame we have. The idea and intention of this activity is to have a thought-provoking discussion. Whilst the panelists will start to discuss the initial points, we would love for you as the attendees to help shape the discussion too. So please put forward your views, and please do also bear with us with any tech queries, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. It is now my honour to hand over to our panel consisting of Dr. Thomas Kaufmann of General Dynamics, Tanya Letisi of European Parliament, Jan Havranek of NATO, and Dr. Jacek Bartosiak of Strategy and Future. And finally, and most importantly, our moderator, General Ben Hodges, former Commanding General of US Army Europe.
Okay, Amar, it looks like we've got everybody. Thanks for the privilege of being a part of this. And we've really got four good experts today that can help us think through the challenges associated with military mobility. Everybody, I am Ben Hodges, former U.S. Army Commander Europe, currently holding the Pershing Chair at CEPA, the Center for European Policy Analysis, which is based in Washington, D.C. I'm talking to you today from Frankfurt. Today's panel of experts and skilled practitioners will help us find a way within the new security context to identify concrete recommendations for improving military mobility in Europe, raise the awareness of its importance, and build momentum to resourcing and implementing those recommendations. At the end of the day, mobility is about giving political leaders options other than a liberation campaign into Lithuania or Poland or Romania. It's about being able to prevent a crisis, demonstrating that we can move as fast or faster than Russian Federation forces or some other developing crisis, to be able to head it off before it becomes a crisis or before it becomes a conflict. For our panel, we've got Dr. Thomas Kaufmann, who's the Vice President of International Business and Services at General Dynamics European Land Systems. He's a retired officer of the German Army, and today is responsible for global sales and service business of GDELS. He holds a PhD in political science and strategy. Tanya Letisi is working as a policy analyst in the European Parliament's in-house think tank, covering security and defense policy. In this role, she authors reports and provides members of the European Parliament with analysis. She has also worked for the NATO Parliamentary Assembly and the European External Action Service. And somehow, despite that workload, she's also doing part-time PhD on transatlantic defense cooperation. Dr. Jacek Bartosiak is the CEO and founder of Strategy and Future, based in Warsaw, Poland. He's an expert on operational concepts of modern warfare in the Central Eastern European theater, NATO's eastern flank, and even in the Western Pacific. He's also one of the working group leaders for CEPA's Military Mobility Workshop, which is currently underway. And he's leading Working Group 2, which is focused on the Suwalki Corridor. So he's bringing some recent and relevant experience and insight, including his own personal reconnaissance of the Suwalki Corridor just a few weeks ago. And then finally, Jan Havranek. Jan formerly served in the Policy Planning Unit at NATO and was just recently announced to be the Deputy Minister of Defense for the Czech Republic. And I think he's officially starts his duties in just a couple more days, although I'm pretty sure he's already working hard in that office. Okay, so our format is going to be sort of a banter, a back and forth, because we want to get as many questions from the audience as possible. So what we'll do is I'll ask a question. The panelists will have 3 minutes to answer it. Then I'll give them a follow-up, and they'll have 2 minutes, and then we'll keep moving that way. And as questions begin to come in from the audience, I won't wait to the end. If there's some that are particularly relevant, I'll pull them into the discussion right off the bat. So, Thomas, Dr. Kaufman, coming to you with the first question. What is the issue of military mobility, and why has this become so important today?
Good afternoon, Ben. Well, the European defense has changed in two significant areas. First, the area of operation, and we're dealing with different distances. If you look in the Cold War scenario, we had to deploy within the inner German border. We talked about 200 to 250 kilometers. Today, we look at the border of the European Union, and here we talk about 2,000, 2,500 kilometers. And if you look at the distances, it's the key question is how do we bring our mechanized forces over this long distance? So that's why military mobility has a crucial role here. I made a quick analysis just to imagine what we're talking about, and a quick exercise. Take an army unit, start in Le Havre, Port Le Havre in France, and try to bring them to Tallinn, Estonia. And we simply looked at the different obstacles we are facing here. It's remarkable we have to cross more than 13 kilometers of water obstacles. We have to cross 7 national borders and customs. We have different infrastructure. Only 40% of the streets and routes are able to carry vehicles with a military last class of 50. And by the way, we talk currently about a main battle tank which is in the class of MLC 80. So this is a very complex exercise to bring our forces from A to B.
Thomas, thanks. So I remember seeing the study that you had done and looking at the map, and it was amazing how many different obstacles had to be negotiated. And of course, we're talking about in peacetime. What are the implications for having to do all of this in peacetime conditions?
I mean, in peacetime means our commercial traffic, the traffic will flow in all directions. We can plan on routes how we can bring our forces to the borders, either on the street, on their own wheels, on railways. But if you look at the railway capacity we have in Europe, I think currently, according to our study, we're able to transport 1.5 mechanized brigades, and that's the entire capacity we have in Europe. The same with our bridges. We have to cross 173 rivers. And if you look at the aging infrastructure, what we see here, we cannot cross these obstacles. So in peacetime, it's already a challenge, and we don't talk about wartime.
Yeah, I think you make a good point that in peacetime, we're all competing for that same limited rail capacity with all the nations of the alliance that are trying to move to the east by rail. So you've got limited rail capacity. What implications does that have for industry then, if you've got such limited rail necessary for moving tanks, for example, the heaviest bits of equipment? What are the implications for industry?
Well, first of all, we need to look that we see that we need to have lighter vehicles, smaller vehicles. We need to have more bridges, simply to customize this to the need of our doctrine, the doctrine to defense in the European defense. And currently we are not there. A part of that, in addition, I mean, Europe, we have coalition forces That means different armies have to cooperate together, which means interoperability is a key element. Not only that they can talk to each other, that we have a common operating picture, but also very simple things, that the vehicles have same interfaces, so NATO standardized interfaces. A simple example is the fuel nozzle. We have different fuel nozzles on vehicles. So to refill a vehicle, an American tank, in a Polish or German brigade represents a challenge. We have to change that.
Great point. I remember from my own experience that we had a real problem just with basic refueling. There is a refuel kit that's out there. It's kind of like a Swiss Army knife that you can do 8 different vehicles, but the fact that you even have to have something like that points to an interoperability challenge. Okay, I'd like to come back to you in a few minutes about other aspects of interoperability, from a maintenance, supply, and operations standpoint. But let me broaden it up now to a broader European context, if you will. Tanya, you work with the European Parliament and help members of the European Parliament understand what the issues are. How would you assess the EU's view on its approach to military mobility? Is this a big deal for the members of the Parliament?
Thank you, Ben. I assume you can hear me well. Yeah, it's a very important question, but I'd like to actually begin by saying that thanks to a book recommendation that you gave me, Supplying War, I learned that the Latin term for military supply, comeatus, can also be translated as the ability to move about freely. Now, for the purpose of this discussion, I'd like to even try to stretch this definition to mean having freedom of action. Now, where I'm getting with this is that in EU speak, lately we've heard a lot of strategic autonomy. Now, I'm sure many people watching us and speaking here have heard about this, but it's important, I think, for the discussion because it can be understood as the common thread that brings together all the pieces of the EU's latest defense action, including the subject of today's panel, military mobility. So today, I'd like to maybe point out a more positive aspect that we've seen in military mobility, despite the fact that politically military mobility has seen better days, and despite the fact that the coronavirus has caused a lot of doom and gloom speculation and talk about the impact on the defense sector and impact on the defense budget, I'd like to point out 2 positive developments that we've seen as we still go through the crisis. The first one is that during the coronavirus crisis, we've seen very strong support from the armed forces to the civilian authorities. Now, this support came in various shapes, from providing military aircraft to perform evacuations or search and rescue, to providing research facilities to help out with research for a vaccine. Now, why is this relevant for military mobility, you ask? Well, because all of these different actions that we've seen, all this different support that we've seen in Europe and beyond, has shown ordinary citizens in Europe the value of having an army and the value of having an army at the ready, prepared to answer crises swiftly. Again, you ask, why is this relevant for military mobility? Well, because this gives politicians legitimacy to deliver on this very point. And this is certainly connected to members of parliament in the European Parliament and of national parliaments. Now, second, the corona crisis has also more or less forced civil protection authorities to establish strong cross-border cooperation channels and to become de facto interoperable. Again, why is this relevant for military mobility? Well, because this recently created architecture of cooperation between civil protection authorities in EU member states can be an excellent blueprint for military mobility itself. Second, because it can also enable a culture of much closer civil-military cooperation in crisis response continentally, but also in terms of international deployment. On a final thought, it's important to keep in mind that Europe prides itself on its special ability to combine civilian action and crisis management with military resources. So my point is that the value of military mobility should be understood in this light too by political leaders. especially because in the EU we have countries that are militarily neutral and countries that are, or whose populations are reluctant to embrace military solutions to crises. So, but by taking this perspective of synergies with civilian instruments, we can demonstrate that military mobility can be a win for everyone's preparedness and for everyone's crisis response. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That is very helpful and also encouraging. But at the same time, why does it seem that what you've said is so compelling, but yet the financial investment within the European Union specifically for military mobility seems to have been dramatically reduced? And when you combine that with the fact that I think the EU did a study a couple of years ago about a gap analysis, and they discovered that 94% of the military's requirements for infrastructure match or overlap with about 94% of the civilian commercial side requirement for infrastructure. So this would seem like kind of a win-win. How come there's not more investment?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's not an easy one. But to begin, so to understand on the EU side of the picture, military mobility, as well as the European Defence Fund, which I'm sure you've heard of before, are both part of the EU's big, grand 7-year budget, which means that they are currently under negotiation. So the entire budget is currently negotiated, and military mobility is a part of it. Now, in the latest agreement reached in July by EU heads of state and government, military mobility was at 1.5 billion for the next 7 years. Now, this is a reduction compared to the initial ambition of the Commission, which was 6.5 billion. The European Defence Fund has also seen a reduction. However, I'd say the game is not over yet. As I said, the negotiations are ongoing, and they're ongoing between the Council, that is the EU member states, and the European Parliament. Now, the European Parliament has the responsibility to adopt, so to approve the budget in its entirety, which means that if it's not happy with its content, it's not going to approve it. Now, this is important. The EP, as such, the European Parliament, has several grievances with the negotiation or with the compromise reached by EU leaders. And one of them includes military mobility, and another includes research and development, which includes defense research and development as well. So we've seen a manifestation of this displeasure when 45 MEPs, just before the summer, they authored a joint letter complaining and calling for the Commission to maintain its initial ambition of 6.5 billion for military mobility. So we just have to see how that's going to go. On the gap analysis, now this is a document that was drafted about a year ago, and it was an analysis of military requirements and civilian networks. And the result indeed was that 94% there's an overlap, which is good, because that tells us, or tells the Commission, which particular gaps in these overlaps are eligible for co-funding. Again, I can't give you a bigger picture as how the money will look like, because this depends on how the compromise is going to look like after the negotiations. The hope is to have more clarity by the end of this month, next month, sorry, October, by the end of October. But I'd say don't hold your breath for that, and instead let's wait for the end of the year to see how that goes.
Okay, thank you. It's obviously complicated, and it's why we've got to get the requirement clear so that our civilian leaders know that this is about giving them options. This is not for the convenience of exercises. Jacek, before I come to you, Thomas, just a heads up. There's a question that's already come in that says, and it's an excellent question, actually, because it looks like rail gauge, the width of rail cars, whether you're on European gauge or the Russian gauge, that's going to be the limiting factor for rail capacity. So that has an impact on the design of equipment, obviously. So after I go through Jacek and with Jan, then I'll come back to you, but I want you to give you a few minutes heads up to be thinking about that question. So, Jacek, Dr. Bartosiak, as I mentioned, you've got so much work invested already, and specifically on the Suwalki Corridor project, but also transportation more broadly across Central Europe. I just read an article. It was in either the Sunday Times or the Financial Times, And it was a nice travel article. And it was about the Masurian Lakes region in northern Poland. And it mentioned that in this one area close to Suwałki, there are 2,000 lakes just in this one region alone. So obviously infrastructure is going to be important and limited. What do you see as the main choke points for NATO forces that would have to move towards or through the Suwałki corridor?
Yeah, thank you for having me on this panel. Of course, it's a very complex question, and depending how you want to approach this issue, if you mean the terrain choke points, there are a few at least. Even without the Russian interference, there would be a few choke points of critical importance. Even if we were living on the planet Mars and we would be happy, go lucky, it would be not easy to project power, send heavy troops across this region, which is intersected with lakes, rivers, swamps, natural woods and forests, very narrow bridges. And there are only a few axes of communication lines that can really carry heavy loads, and not to mention railroads. If you add to this picture the Russian interference, long-range fires, fire maneuvering, and very long-range missiles, then it complicates the situation very much. And that brings the speed and military mobility into the forefront of this ongoing already sort of confrontation with Russia that is using the new generation warfare methods to show that NATO is toothless in this part of the region. That's why if we have the rapid reaction, if we have this speed, mobility, and in crisis, we can really move forces of significant combat value in the proximity of the theater, then it's a very strong signal that, okay, guys, we are here, okay, so we're ready to go. And that brings me to another set of choke points, meaning regulatory, political. Europe is a set of countries, each with different regulations, self-governmental regulations, all those things that need to be adjusted. And as we all know, things have changed to the worse since the end of the Cold War. And the battlefront is at least 1,000 kilometers to the east, which is further from the Atlantic coast, which is a US sea power operational base. Okay, so you need a port to disembark and move the troops on the continent. And it's far away from Bremerhaven or other ports on the Western European coast. So this is critically important, and our Russian friends will be probing it or finding out in the strategic flows whether it's deterrent enough for the Balts, for sure, whether they feel confident. So this is it. Now the case of Belarus comes into play again and again in the history of the continent. Maybe I will have a chance to speak later about it. But if Belarus is in the Russian hands, and it's a basis for the power projection with heavy logistics in place, not rotational, coming for exercises, the game will change to the worse as well.
You anticipated my follow-up question. If you can, in just 2 minutes, what's the significance of what's happening in Belarus right now? And if Russia was able to have ground forces permanently based in Belarus, what are the implications for?
Belarus is a pivot in Central and Eastern Europe for Poland, for Russia, for Ukrainians, and for the Baltic states. Especially the transportation hub of the city of Grodno on the Nemunas River is hanging, it's a good word, it's hanging on all the movements that we would like to have towards Kaunas and Vilnius. Actually, and it's in Belarus, by the way, so theoretically maybe in the Russian hands very soon. So that would, completely undercut all our planning of movement. Our east flank, right flank would be completely exposed by the major communication hub that can really move forces in each direction, doing whatever they want. And it will be a huge political problem because the military will be pushing for solutions. Okay, I'm quite sure what I'm saying, and this is a major problem. And the second dimension of this problem is, and again, I was traveling last week to check it out, this war theater between the Bug and the Narew River, Warsaw, Vistula River, and the Belarusian border, so a little bit south of the Suwałki Gap. And if you remember the Schwarzkopf maneuver of the left hook in the Desert Storm operation, so any heavy Russian troops on the Polish-Belarusian border will have a pinning effect on the Polish forces that will be screening Warsaw and protecting Warsaw from the direct tank rain from the east. And that will create quite a tension for the, possibility to move Polish forces to the Suwałki Gap. So the future of Belarus is a pivotal thing for the Baltic states primarily.
Yeah, it's a great point and well made, and this is why it's so important that we figure out ways to help Belarus keep resisting Russian pressure to put troops in there. Jan, before I come to you, just a heads up to Tanya. Tanya, I think you can see there's a question that's come in. Says, would the budget on EU military R&D reduced? Can military mobility be realistic? So when I get through with Jan and then Thomas, I'll come back to you with that. Jan, interestingly, the next question is, has NATO reviewed this gap analysis that we just talked about? And if so, does NATO agree with the assessment of the critical gaps? So the leading question to you is, what is NATO's process? So I'm going to ask you to wear your old NATO hat right now for looking at military mobility. And I remember 2 years ago, you told me that we needed to do a workshop on military mobility, and that's where the whole thing started. So describe that process, but also are you familiar with this gap analysis that the EU did?
Thanks very much, Ben, and good afternoon, colleagues. Just very happy to be here, and as you pointed out, Ben, at the beginning, I'm in the transition, and I guess transition is a fitting word for this workshop on moving forces and military mobility in general. I cannot answer that question directly because this would be this should be directed at the enablement and resilience team that deals with these requirements and who are in touch at NATO headquarters and who are in touch with the EU counterparts on this very issue. So it wouldn't be entirely fair for me to answer this question. But if I should bet my money, I would say I think so, because the staff-to-staff cooperation between NATO and EU on this level, on the informal basis, works very well, and I'm sure we're going to get to that question. But to take a step back and provide maybe just a very few comments about the process you asked about and the overall inputs into the military mobility discussion. I just want to start by saying that the military mobility has been at the very center of NATO's political and military adaptation over the past 6 years, since basically Crimea and since Readiness Action Plan that was adopted in Wales. Every single decision by the Allies concerning NATO's military adaptation and civil military adaptation has had some aspect of military mobility included one way or another, be it the enhancement of the NATO response force, the reform of the NATO response force, establishment of enhanced forward presence or tailored forward presence in the East, and to continue with NATO's readiness initiative in 2018, NATO's deterrence and defense efforts in all strategic directions. Military mobility has been under consideration. I should also mention reform of NATO command structure and establishment of two joint commands dealing with with the issues of military mobility, one in Norfolk, Joint Force Command Norfolk, and the other Joint Support and Enablement Command in Ulm, in charge of rear area operations. So this is just to illustrate how important the overall issue is. And of course, on the political level, and this is why my concern is looking now from my national perspective, as I'm about to assume the new role that you mentioned, I'm afraid that because there is no imminence of any sort of major threat to NATO, we are sort of losing the attention to that issue. And there has been a lot happening between the NATO and the European Union on staff-to-staff level, but I always felt, that in order for military mobility requirements to be implemented in full, we do need a significant and strong and continuous political leadership. So this would be my opening pitch, and I'm happy to elaborate on any of this further.
Stand by 1 second. Tanya, are you aware whether or not the EU's gap analysis was shared with NATO?
Yeah, it wasn't only shared, it's a product of EU-NATO cooperation. It wasn't just shared, they worked together. NATO shared their military, the EU provided their civilian requirements, and they put them all together, and there you see the 94% overlap. So it's a...
All right, that's clear. Jan, let me ask you to put your Czech Ministry of Defense hat on now. What's happening inside the Czech Republic in terms of, the...
Yes, well, I would say that the most important project in the military mobility area is establishment of a new host nation support battalion to deal with the as a part of the capability targets assigned to the Czech Republic within NATO's defense planning process. So this should be sort of our flagship military mobility project. But obviously, in the non-military domain, we still have a way to go in terms of cross-border movement, facilitating the access and cross-border transition. I mean, you will very well remember that one of the first Dragoon rides that started a couple of years ago went through the Czech Republic, and it was a pain, if I may say so, starting right at the German-Czech border. We're fulfilling all those requirements in order to facilitate, for instance, deployment of VJTF in case of activation, to facilitate transition of troops going to NATO exercises in the region, etc. But not only it requires checking the box on the paper and turning an orange or amber box into green, but it also requires testing and exercising these requirements regularly. So as I'm sort of looking ahead to 2021 and look at the exercises, national exercises that we will be conducting, I really do want to prioritize the military mobility basics and test them and exercise them throughout the next year.
Thanks, Jan. I've been impressed with what the Czech Republic's establishment of this host nation battalion. I think that's a step in the right direction. Have somebody specifically committed to that. All right, Thomas. I gave you a heads up a little earlier. This is a question from Garth R. Says, as rail loading gauge is a significant constraining factor in vehicle design, does the limited rail capacity reduce the necessity to have rail transport as a ceiling on design innovation?
Thank you for this question. I think it's quite the opposite. If we have less capacity, but we need to give the commanders with their equipment various options, how they move and maneuver through the area of operation. And if we have railroads as one option, we need to make sure that we can load as many vehicles as possible and bring them on the railway. The same if you want to use then the regular routes. We need to have vehicles who can pass tunnels, who are not too heavy to pass bridges, so that they can use the infrastructures we have. But a part of that, we also need to look into if neither railroads nor streets are available, if we talk about a real conflict, then we have to go cross country. And here we need bridge assets. We have approximately, as I said, 10 kilometers of bridge capacity within NATO. But we talk only about one route. What I described is one way from Le Havre to Tallinn. And there we already face 13 kilometers of obstacles. So we do not have enough bridge systems. And we need to look when it comes to design of vehicles, of course, on standards. And one of the standards will be, as before, tunnel profile and loading capacities, loading dimensions. That's a key driver and remains a key driver.
Okay, thanks very much for that. Tanya, there was a question. It says, with the budget on EU military R&D reduced, can military mobility be realistic?
Yeah, it's an important question. So 3 quick points. First, to echo what Jan said, with political will and political awareness, everything is possible, no matter how much money you have or how little money you have. I'd also like to see a bigger budget. Of course, I'd like to see a bigger budget. But at the same time, let's also keep in mind that for the EU, this is uncharted territory. This is the first time the EU is actually involved in something like this. So 1.5 billion, if it stays like this, again, it's not certain, but if it stays like this, 1.5 billion over the next 7 years is still 1.5 billion more than we've had before. Just to keep that in mind. A second point, even if it stays like this, this would put even more pressure on the EU and on member states to spend this money strategically and wisely, as strategically and as wisely as possible. And the third point, in the end, the EU money is there simply to incentivize member states to spend on this. So that's the whole point. In the end, if you think about it, the ball is in the court of the member states. They are the ones that have to propose the strategically relevant project in order to access this extra money from the EU budget. So the ball is in their court. And a final point, hopefully, the exercises such as the strategic compass process, which is a 2-year process that the EU is going through now to assess their strategic vulnerabilities, to do a threat analysis, in order to achieve more strategic convergence in terms of threat perception. Hopefully, through exercises like this, and including through exercises such as the NATO 2030 process, member states will realize themselves that military mobility can be very useful for their own security.
All right. I knew you would be able to handle that question without any problem. Okay, Jacek, Tanya just set the bar very high. I'm fixed to give you a triple question, okay? But they're also closely related. You can handle all 3 of them, okay? So as I'm looking at the panel behind you, it says, strategy and future. So these 3 questions are exactly in your lane. First of all, this is from our friend Ivan Vinik, who's a former member of the Ukrainian Rada. And he highlights the fact that Russia is dreaming of regaining control of the Suwalki corridor. Of course, the Zapad 17 or 17 was focused there. And that the mobility of NATO forces, in particular in the region of Lithuania and Poland, is going to be a critical element of deterrence. So that's a strategic setting there, okay? And then from Ali Gulmus, he says, I would like to ask about the compatibility of the principle of surprise and mobility of large troops in certain areas in the communication age. Is it possible? Could Russian Federation forces mass and surprise us? And then the third question, it's related to the same sort of situation, from Sammy McKay. With the increase in technology and lethality, this causes an increase in survivability, which causes cycle seems continuous. Okay, this, I tell you what, that's going to be, I'm going to say that one for Thomas. I'll come back to him. I misread the question in the beginning. So back to Russian interest in getting control over Suwalki corridor, and is it possible to maintain surprise and move large bodies of troops in the modern communication age?
Start responding first to the second question. Again, it's a brilliant question to be tested on the battlefield between peer competitors. It was possible when, again, Schwarzkopf was what did this strategic surprise by moving the whole corps left of the expected axis of attack in Kuwait and southern Iraq. But of course, the U.S. Forces enjoy the advantage of modern scouting battle, surveillance systems, and observation. So it still remains to be seen between the peer competitors in a symmetrical battlefield whether it's doable, and that increases the importance of Belarus, for example, and stationing heavy troops there right on the border because I will not be seeing them moving for a long time. Okay. This question also triggers another question. With the advance of technology and sensors, long-range fires, long-range observation, the modern scouting battle is expanding, which means that the active defense postures will be more and more visible across the world, including in NATO eastern flank, which means that the conventional approaches of stationing troops and having the numbers are becoming less and less relevant in a way. Of course, it's very difficult always to balance how much is relevant or how much relevant. So I don't want to jump into hasty conclusions, but it's always difficult. And speaking and answering the first question, if we really want to know what the Russian war plan would be, we need to think what is the center of gravity of NATO. Meaning what Russia would like to achieve, to seize or destabilize or destroy in order to think that it's winning or has won. And I think that at the moment I would say that this is the cohesion of the alliance. Okay? So if Russia, by military posturing or even some low-intensity action in Suwalki corridor, would demonstrate that NATO is not capable of really protecting the Baltic states, and also would split the interests of the NATO countries, for example, Poland and Germany, or Poland and France, even Poland and Baltic states and the United States, by achieving the objectives and increasing the threshold of trying to restore the status quo ante, then it is perfectly possible, and Suwalki corridor and area around would be a perfect place, as this place is a treacherous place if we really want to project power into the Baltic states. And ending what I wanted to say is that that's why the posture, an adequate posture in peacetime, but already in the competition era, is so critical, because that demonstrates both capability and determination to defend and capability to really make it happen. And Russia, by using this under-threshold kinetic, coercions, is trying to show to the world that it's not there. That's why the countries of the NATO eastern flank are so fragile and are so sensitive about the Western European approach to that and whether enough forces are there. And of course, the mobility. That's why we like mobility, and we want to see reinforcements quickly in place here from the West.
Yeah, great point. And you highlight the need for what we call the speed of recognition. The first thing we see won't be a column of T-72s, and it won't be an American satellite that detects whatever it is that's happening. It's going to be, how well can we fuse all the different types of intelligence plus civilian information flowing in across NATO's eastern flank to recognize something before it actually happens. Is this dock workers strike in Riga? Is that really just a bunch of unhappy longshoremen, or is this something that's been fomented somewhere else? Okay, so Jan, I know I may lose you a couple minutes early, so I'm going to give you a going away gift here. This is a question from Henning Wilkins. It says, why do we focus so much on the land? So I'm going to ask you, recognizing that the Czech Republic does not have a maritime tradition, that you don't have seaports there, but you do have airports and you do have rivers. And putting on your NATO hat again, what's the broader context of military mobility besides roads and rail
Thanks,
that we've
Ben.
been talking about?
I'd say it's an overall resilience as a part of our broader deterrence concept. So of course, I mean, the discussion has been heavily length-centric for obvious reasons, because that's where the difficulties are most obvious, and they've been tested. But we do have to think about military mobility not only in terms of other domains such as air, but also virtually. So far, we haven't really mentioned cyber networks or networks in general that actually are the key enabler of any mobility, be it railroads, be it ports, be it cross-border crossings, bridges. I mean, you name it. So I think the question from the audience is actually quite fitting. In the sense that we do need to think about it in a very complex and not just a land-centric way.
All right. Thank you very much. Yeah, the question is a fair question, but today we are focused primarily on land mobility, but the question is a good one because the alliance is going to require access to seaports, airports. I think rivers are probably underutilized. The Danube River needs to be better maintained so that we could use it for moving large cargo. So, Tanya, just a heads up, you'll get what'll probably be maybe the last question. You'll see it's from Matt Karras about the Union Customs Code, all right? So give you a chance to think about that. But Thomas, I'm going to give you this double question here. The first, it's from Sammy McKay. This is the one that I screwed up earlier. With the increase in technology and lethality, this causes an increase in survivability technology, which causes an increase in lethality, et cetera, within the military environment. So in other words, there's a cycle. How do you get a bigger bullet, then you get more armor, a bigger bullet, more survival, and it's somewhere the physics takes over. The cycle seems continuous and results in further weight on armored vehicles and therefore has military implications. Do you see an endpoint to the weight increase, or what's the fallout of increasingly adding weight, whether it's more steel, active or reactive add-on armor? Where do we stop? So that's one part of it. And then the second question from a great engineer, I believe, Richard Beetson, on combat engineering close support bridging. Can you comment on interoperability and also agreeing a common European theater requirement in terms of military load classification and span? So two technical questions that have industry implications.
Well,
Thomas, how about taking those, please?
How we look into this competition between protection and lethality. And the result is that the vehicles are becoming more heavier. Today we're talking about MLC 80. If you ask industry, I think we have to have a broader approach here, because the combat value of a system is most important when you can deploy the system. If you can't deploy it, it's worth nothing. So from our point of view, a vehicle in the class of MLC 50 need to be the objective to maneuver in our European defense area. And we talked about investments in military mobility, and we talked about renovating bridges infrastructure. This will take decades, but we need to have solutions today and tomorrow. So yes, we are in this cycle. I think we need to break the cycle, and we need to become back and we need to be less heavy, We need to have more multi-purpose, multi-role systems. And then I think it will not go in a direction that we say we talk about one, let me say super tank, but maybe this is a decentralized system with various vehicles of accomplishing a mission. So the answer is MLC50 should be the right thing. Otherwise, we are too heavy, and we cannot be there where we need to be. The second question, Ben, was related to interoperability for the combat engineers. I remember the first meeting that you say the engineers is key because they fulfill to bring the troops to the front. And here, as an example, we have with the NATO different bridge systems. Our focus here is that we find, for example, coupling devices where we can couple a bridge, a pontoon bridge from one ally with another to support each other. Combat engineering plays a crucial role. And when we talk about combat engineering, at the end we talk about a tactical bridge which we are able to deploy within minutes. The combat engineers don't build bridges which takes a month or a week to do this. They need to do this in minutes. And here, as I said before, we don't have sufficient capabilities. And we need to have more bridges, either on NATO level, and the few we have, we need to make sure that they can work together, that we can couple them together. Otherwise, I'm not very optimistic that we can really meet this requirement.
Optimistic can really meet this. Back to the first question, what's your, just very briefly, your assessment of unmanned systems or turrets that don't require crews? I mean, this seems to be
it's a technology which we will see moving forward, that we see manned-unmanned teaming. The question is resilience and how it works in a battlefield environment. Maybe it worked today in a civil and a laboratory environment, but we need to have stable communication and connections between these decentralized systems. But we are convinced that the technology is moving in this direction. We need to reduce crew because the armies, we don't have the big armies anymore. We have more specialists. And that's why I think unmanned systems like turrets, as an example, as you mentioned that, is to get also weight out of a system, out of the vehicle. So we need to look in all angles to meet this magic number of MLC50, reduced crew, sufficient lethality, and sufficient protection. And we have to accept that there will be a remaining element of vulnerability. We cannot protect 100%. So we need to find the right balance here, the right balance between the protection, the lethality, and mobility. It's a very complex process. Lethality and mobility.
okay. Yeah, there's always going to be a need for protected mobile firepower, but if we can do it without having people in it, that makes a huge difference. Okay, Tanya, we're going to go to you with the last question. This is from Matt Karras. The Union Customs Code mandates digital customs forms by 2025. The EU recently created an EU 302 form for military shipments, and it plans to digitize it in the future. Do you see a digitized?
So this 302 form, for everyone to understand, is basically a form to streamline cross-border movement permissions. Now, the EU 302 form was created in 2019 to be identical with the NATO 302 form. So the forms are different but identical at the same time. And I think it's often underestimated that this process was a result of quite a delicate negotiation between all the EU's member states, which again, some of them are non-NATO members, some of them are militarily neutral. So it's useful to keep that in mind. So the 302 form is a clear product and result of EU-NATO cooperation. And it's also a proof that that the two want certainly to be complementary to each other and not duplicate. Now, so the digitizing question, to be fully honest, I don't know. But since both organizations are clearly moving towards more digitalization, to me it would seem common sense to do so, given all the hard work that's been put behind this. So I would say yes, but don't quote me on it.
Our last 2 minutes, this is the lightning round. So all three of you will get 1 minute to say whatever you didn't get to say before, just one message you want to send out to people who are still listening. And Thomas, we'll start with you, then Jacek, then Tanya.
Lighter, more capable to interoperate with each other.
Lighter.
We need to invest in bridges.
More capable to interoperate with each other.
We need to make sure that in the bridges we invest, that they are interoperable with our allies. We need to show, and if it's a deterrence based on credibility, and we need to demonstrate that we're able to fight to avoid a fight. And that's why we need to look always in the area where we operate, and we need to have the right assets for that. And that's the element, and that's what industry is doing currently and ongoing with our customers to check requirements so that our future commanders, that we provide them systems so they can accomplish their mission in the future. That's our task. Thank you.
Yeah, we badly needed mobility, and I would, borrow the term from the, U.S. Pacific contingencies, dispersed lethality. Dispersed lethality with more sensors, lighter troops, faster moving, being here and there, agile, maybe even leaner, but agile, complicating the opponent's planning every day, imposing costs on up to prohibitive levels. And this is the modern battlefield, and we need to be masters of the modern battlefield in that respect. And of course, mobility is key, always, and it will be even more so in the future.
Big responsibility. Well, fine. Then I will choose to use a quote from Teddy Roosevelt to explain exactly what Europe is trying to do. That is, speak softly but carry a big stick. Now, Europe is trying to build the stick at the moment. Yes, sometimes it's slow, at times it can't agree, sometimes it's bureaucratic, but this is the first time it's trying to do so seriously, and that's why we have to encourage to be constructive and not quit, because it certainly is an uphill battle. Thank you.
All right, super. Thanks, all three of you, and Jan for helping to enrich the thinking here about how we can move quick enough to prevent the conflict from ever happening. Thanks to Defense IQ, and thanks to General Dynamics European Land Systems for making